Something that's interesting about our human experience, I think that all of us, is that none of us set out to live a life that is below average. None of us want to earn a below average income. We don't want to have below average intelligence. We don't want to be a below average driver. We don't want to be a below average friend. We don't want to be below average in our careers. We all want to excel. We want to be somebody. We want to do something. In fact, most of us, we would say we don't even want to be average. We want to be above average. We want to be excellent. We want to be the best that we can be. We don't want to go through this life just going through this routine or this thing. We want to accomplish something. We want to achieve something. Nobody wants to be a below average parent. You want to be a great parent. Nobody wants to be any of these things. And there is this desire within us toward accomplishment, toward excellence, toward greatness. And the disciples of Jesus had this exact same desire. We see this theme throughout the Gospels, where things would happen, and they would wonder among themselves, and sometimes they would overtly ask, or even worse, have their mom ask, who is going to be the greatest? And this isn't necessarily the worst question, because there were times that Jesus would teach, and he would say, the person who does this will be great in the kingdom of heaven. He had taken Peter, James, and John up to the Mount of Transfiguration, and in a sense setting them apart from the other 12 disciples. He had said that Peter would play a leadership role and a foundational role in the early church. So this idea of greatness was not a new one, but the disciples tended to look at it the wrong way. Their aspirations weren't necessarily wrong, the desire for greatness, but they didn't know how to get there. In fact, if you look at our world and how people would tell you to achieve greatness in your job or in parenting or in life, it's usually going to look very different from the definition of greatness that Jesus has for us. And so today we're in Matthew chapter 18. If you have your Bibles, you can turn there. We'll have the words here on the screen as well. Matthew chapter 18, Jesus has, as we've been going through the book of Matthew together, he has finished his Galilean ministry, and in his heart and in his mind, he has turned his face toward Jerusalem, though at this account, he is still in Galilee, about to make the trip to Jerusalem, where he will ultimately, as Matthew has recorded for us, where he will die and give his life for us. But he's turned, and he's teaching his disciples, really in chapter 18, the whole of the chapter, of what it is to be a disciple in community with other believers. How does this work? How does the kingdom work? How does this interrelationship happen? And so they're asking themselves this question: how do I make my life matter? So let's pick up Matthew chapter 18, reading at verse number 1. And at that time, the disciples came to Jesus saying, who is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven? I mean, you're not making any bones about it. Now, you can understand this question a little bit when you think about the fact that the disciples were probably thinking of the kingdom in terms of a literal political kingdom in Jerusalem, the reestablishment of the Davidic throne. All right, Jesus, when you go to Jerusalem and when you set up your kingdom, can I be general? Can I be chief of staff? Can I be on your right hand? Can I be your top advisor? Who's going to be great in your kingdom? Who is going to sit in the important seats? This is what they're asking. Can I be a part of your cabinet? Can I be Secretary of State? Can I be? This is what they're asking. It goes on, verse number 2. And calling to him a child, he put him in the midst of them and said, truly, I say to you. So this truly I say to you, this is like he's about to make an important statement. When you see this lead up This is like me saying, all right, I'm going to tell you something really important, so listen. This is what Jesus is doing. Truly, I say to you, unless you turn and become like children, you will never enter the kingdom of heaven. Now, when you think in terms of generals of the military and chief advisors and vice kings, if that's a thing, and all of these things, you don't think of one of the attributes of those being childlike. Great in the kingdom doesn't equate to childlike. Yet Jesus is saying to them, unless you turn, unless you change and become like children, not only are you not going to have a place of greatness in the kingdom, you're not even going to get in. So when Jesus says that we are supposed to be childlike, what does he mean? In what way are we supposed to imitate children? Are we supposed to be immature? Let me tell you, as a father of 5, kids are immature. Are we supposed to be non-intellectual or silly or playful? I mean, all these things you hear, we're supposed to be childlike. Are these the things that he's talking about? I mean, I don't mean to be mean to kids, but they're not the smartest tools in the drawer. It's just, you've got to learn. I still remember a time when my niece was about Will's age, and she was, a year, 18 months, 2, somewhere in that range, and we were down at my parents' house and eating breakfast, and my other brother, her other uncle, said to her, hey, we're eating breakfast, we're having eggs. Hey, do you know where eggs come from? And she's like, no. And he goes, they come from chickens. And she's sitting there at the table, and she starts going, where are the chickens? Where do the chickens go? Children they're just... So is that what we're supposed to be? Are we supposed to check our brains at the door as believers? Is our life supposed to be whimsical and silly and playful? Is that what does he mean when he says that unless you turn and become like children, you cannot enter the kingdom of heaven? Verse number 4. Whoever humbles himself like this child is greatest in the kingdom of heaven. Being a childlike Christian is not about checking out your brain or being immature or any of these things. Being irresponsible. Children can be very irresponsible. The point that Jesus is driving, what he wants us to see in a child is their humility. Humility is the most important trait for kingdom advancement. That's what it means. So, what is humility? We got a few quotes here. This is from Augustine. He said, do you wish to rise in your Christian walk? Begin by descending. You plant a tower that will pierce the clouds. Lay first the foundation of humility. C.S. Lewis, probably the most well-known quote on humility, says, humility is not thinking of yourself or thinking less of yourself, it's thinking of yourself less. Spurgeon says, humility is to make a right estimate of oneself. And then finally, the late or great Yogi Berra, if it ain't the heat, it's the humility. Anyway, I just had to include that. Go back to that one. What I think is interesting in this thing here, you probably can't see it, but this is a quote about humility, and here are his 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 championship rings from the Yankees. So, whatever. When we're talking about humility, are we talking about some anti-self-esteem, downtrodden? What do we mean? I'm first going to give you a long definition and more thorough. Then I'm going to give you a short definition. Humility can refer to a state of being, a general lowness in status or rank or of economic means. In this sense, humility is the opposite of importance or wealth. It can also refer to a virtue that involves modest self-perception. In this sense, it is the opposite of pride and arrogance. So there's kind of two images when it comes to humility. One is more objective, and one is more subjective. So this is the way I summarize it. I think the best way the clearest way to define it is really to give it opposite. Humility is the opposite of importance, or maybe you could say self-importance and pride. When it comes to children and humility, because children can be very, 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 very self-centered. Is that enough varies, parents? I'm not sure. Very self-centered. But it doesn't change their status or their rank. Children are not high up on the social ladder of status. They are told what to do. I was thinking, I had this just happen just yesterday. We were all in our Sequoia, and we were headed somewhere, and Audrey, our 2-year-old, did not want to get in her car seat and buckle up. And one of our other daughters, our older one, said, "Audrey, buckle up." And Audrey, she's 2, as clear as day, she goes, "You're not the boss of me." And I turned around and I said, "Audrey, I am the boss of you. Get in your car seat." And she sat down. And in a lot of ways, that is an accurate record of, or an accurate image of what humility is. Humility says, I'm not more important than you. You're not more important than me, but I'm not more. I look at myself and I don't care if I'm smarter or make more money or better looking or more this or more that or whatever. Status becomes a non-issue. It's when Jesus walks in and wraps a towel around his waist and washes his disciples' feet. What's he doing? He's taking a position of low importance. Did that mean he wasn't an important person? Absolutely not. The King of the universe practiced humility. He made it up the ladder by moving down, washing his disciples' feet, and ultimately giving his life. And that's what humility is. It's not thinking I'm worthless, but it's being willing to take a low position, a position of low status, in imitation of Jesus. So then, why are some in the church elevated to leadership positions? So if we're supposed to be this community of humble people that you can't even enter the kingdom of God unless you have the childlike humility, why is it then that some are then put in leadership positions at church? And, we call them pastors or elders or deacons or ministry leaders or all these. Why is this? Are we doing church wrong? Are we disobeying this command to be childlike when we put people in elevated positions of leadership? Now, I want to show you one verse from Paul's list of qualifications of elders. This is in 1 Timothy chapter 3, verse number 2. And as we read this, I want you to think about this. And the answer will be easy. What is the one trait that is the underpinning of all of these? I'll give you a hint. It's what we're talking about today. But I want you to think about it. Therefore, an overseer or an elder, or maybe you could even say a pastor, an overseer must be above reproach, the husband of one wife, sober-minded, self-controlled, respectable, hospitable, able to teach, not a drunkard, not violent but gentle, not quarrelsome, and not a lover of money. Could you be that if you weren't humble? Humility is the most important trait for kingdom advancement. If you want to go up in the kingdom, you have to go down. The greatest among you, Jesus said, will be the one who serves. There has been, over the last few years, I would call it an epidemic of pastors having to leave the ministry, high-profile pastors, big churches, having to leave the ministry for moral reasons and sin issues. And one of the common threads that you hear from them is they say things like, those who are still in the church and trying to be reconciled to Christ and to the body and who are walking through that, they'll say, I got to a place where I was accountable to no one. And in the church, those who go up the ladder are called to serve more. And those who are unwilling to serve don't climb the ladder. The way up in the kingdom is down. Let's go on. So Jesus continues. He had just said, whoever becomes like a child. This is verse number 5 now. He says, whoever receives. So now he switches it. Now he's saying, first of all, you need to be like a child. Now he's talking about how we treat other people. And I don't think he's talking here about a literal child. I think he's talking about disciples, believers, other people who become childlike. Whoever receives one such child in my name receives me. So receiving someone who is in a humble state is the same as receiving Jesus. But whoever causes one of these little ones who believe in me to sin, it would be better for him to have a great millstone fastened around his neck and to be drowned in the depths of the sea. Could these two things be more different? Jesus said, on the one hand, if you receive a little child, a humble disciple, a humble believer, if you receive them, it's the same as receiving Jesus. If you hug them, it's the same as hugging Jesus. If you love them, it's the same as loving Jesus. If you serve them, it's the same as serving Jesus. But the opposite of that height is an incredible depth. To the one who rejects and causes them to sin, it would be better for a millstone to be tied around his neck and him to be thrown into the sea. What is this millstone? They would have usually a donkey that would be tied or mounted to this. They would put the wheat all around this circle and it would push around and it would grind it under here. This was a stone. This is a large millstone. A stone large enough that it would take a beast of burden to push it. And when it says the depths of the sea, the idea is like out in the middle of the ocean. So think about this. How bad of a sin is it? How terrible of an offense is it if it's better to have a millstone tied around your neck and thrown into the sea than it is to cause one of these to stumble? Next verse. Woe to the world, this world. This is a condemnation of it. For temptations to sin. For it is necessary that temptations come, but woe to the one by whom the temptation comes. For the person who causes someone to sin, it would be better for a millstone to be tied around their neck. Woe to the person through whom the temptation comes. What's he talking about? Imagine this. Imagine you had made two great mistakes in your life. You would introduce two different people to sin. And through that, you had brought them into sin. And let's say you had even brought them, but through that sin, they had left the faith. They had they'd entered apostasy. They had walked away from God. And this had happened two different times in your life. Maybe they happened both at the same time. You introduced both of these people to the same sin, or you sinned against them in a certain way that caused them to run away from God. And let's say that the first one was, let's put this 30 years ago. Let's say the first one was just somebody in your church, somebody who sat in the pew every Sunday, and the other one was Billy Graham in the middle of his ministry. So you caused two people to leave the faith. One was Billy Graham, and the other was just somebody on the pew. And Jesus is saying that to cause that average person who sits on the pew, that person of humility, that nobody knows, nobody will ever know, people know Billy Graham's name, to lead that person astray is a sin so grave that it would be better to be cast in the sea with a millstone tied around your neck. There can be this temptation in a church that we want to have a certain kind of people who look a certain way, who talk a certain way, who have certain means. You'll hear it sometime, around church, about we're trying to attract, high-capacity leaders and high-capacity people. And in a sense, I guess I get what they're saying. But the church is for the humble. The church is for people who have nowhere else to go. The church is for people who, in their status and station in life, are no more than a child. The church is for the least among us. And may we always be a church that loves everyone, especially those that the world would consider low. May this be the most loving place they've ever entered. May they experience the love of Jesus. This image is shown in James chapter 2. You remember James's picture. He said, you're sinning. When somebody comes in who is wealthy and has gold and does all these things, you say, hey, come and have a good seat. And when somebody who's poor comes in, you say to them, well, sit over here on the floor. And James calls them out as sinful. And Jesus says this, not only are you to be humble, to practice humility, to take on the humility of a child, you are to receive humble people into your midst. You will love them as my people. I pray that that's the church that God gives us. That's the church that He builds for us. That's what He does. That we are people who carry out this commandment. Let's go back. Matthew chapter 18. Pick up at verse number 8. And now he switches gears just a little bit. He keeps on this idea of sin, of what it is if you cause someone else to sin, and now he's going to talk about sin in our own lives. And if your hand or your foot causes you to sin, cut it off and throw it away. We've seen this language already in the Sermon on the Mount. It is better for you to enter life crippled or lame than with 2 hands or 2 feet to be thrown into the eternal flame. Go on, verse number 9. And if your eye causes you to sin, tear it out and throw it away. It is better for you to enter life with 1 eye than with 2 eyes and to be thrown into the fire of hell. So he's gone now from causing other people to sin, but what about you? Thank you. One, two, there we go. What about sin in your own life? And this is the second time Jesus has said this. Take extreme measures to get rid of sin. Extreme. Do whatever it takes to rid yourself of sin, even if it's to rip out your eye or cut off your hand. But what does sin have to do with humility? What does ridding ourselves of sin have to do with living out this childlike life and faith? What does that have to do with sin? One of the greatest expressions of humility is obedience. And one of the greatest expressions of pride, the opposite of humility, is rebellion. How did my daughter express her humility, express her station? She got in the seat when Dad said to get in the seat. Humility and obedience are linked together. Next. We can't be both humble and disobedient. If we're going to put ourselves in the position where He is Lord and we follow Him, that's really what pride is. Did God really say not to eat of the tree of the garden? He just doesn't want your eyes to be open. Then you will be wise. It's pride. Last one. As we prepare for the communion table reminds us that even though sin is terrifyingly evil, we have forgiveness in Jesus. In just a moment, when we pass out the elements and we prepare to partake of the table, and we've talked about what it would be like, Jesus says, to cause someone else to sin, and what would be the right punishment. In fact, not only what would be the right punishment, what would be getting off easy. And some of us can look at periods in our own life and say, did I commit that sin? The truth is, all sin that we commit is deserving of the millstone treatment. But when we gather around the table of the Lord and we take the bread and the cup, we're reminding ourselves, thank you, that sin is terrifying, but Jesus forgives. The second thing that we're reminded as we take communion together is this. The communion table reminds us that in Christ, we are all equal. And in the passage in 1 Corinthians where Paul talks about the communion, and the one that I quote when we take communion, in the previous chapter, he's talking about unity and equality, and he says this, for you all partake of one loaf. You are all partakers of one loaf. And the imagery is this, is that in the early church, there was not these positions of status. I mean, one of the biggest scandals of the early church was their equality. Men, women, Jews, Greeks, slave, free, rich, poor, literally gathering around the same table and eating off of the same loaf and drinking out of the same cup. This didn't happen. And so when we pass around and eat together from the same loaf, it's a powerful image. I know some of you like the little crackers that are already all portioned off. And hey, just be grateful we haven't gone to a single cup. But the reason we do this is I want to be reminded, I think it's a powerful image, that we all of us in Christ eat from the same loaf. We're one body. I'm not better than you. You're not better than me. And the table of the Lord reminds us that we're all together. No matter our economics, no matter our background, no matter our race or nationality or where we came from, no matter if our parents were believers or unbelievers, it doesn't matter. We all eat of the same loaf together because that's what Jesus has done for us. If we could all stand together, and if those who are going to help serve communion, if you'd go ahead and come.